Okay, everybody, thanks for coming. This is the last class of 3. Just to review quickly, in classes 1 and 2, we talked about the background of Fidel's revolutionary legacy, what made him a revolutionary Marxist, and we went into the bigger historical period that shaped Fidel and then which he shaped with his ideas. That's going to be the thing that we're going to focus on in this last class, is how Fidel and his revolutionary politics and practice shaped this the 20th century, the last half of the 20th century, where he was, in my opinion, the most outstanding and, in terms of the longevity, revolutionary figure that emerged in the last half of the 20th century. Among the background factors that we talked about in class 1 was the Latin America anti-imperialist tradition, the consequences of World War II, the rise of the U.S. as a global empire, and the decline of the European colonial powers, particularly the French and the British, the rise of the Soviet Union with the victory over German imperialism in World War II, and then one of the main unintended consequences of World War II, which is the rise of the anti-colonial upsurge, the struggle for national independence, which in many cases in the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Korean Revolution, led also to actually socialist revolutions or revolutionary national liberation struggles that were led by people who were inspired by socialist and Marxist ideas. Then in class 2, we talked about how this background that shaped Fidel, that shaped him in the cauldron of revolutionary politics in Cuba in the 1940s and 1950s, that led to the conditions of the Cuban Revolution, the growth of the July 26th movement, the seizure of power by Batista, the aftermath of the Machado dictatorship, and the 1952 coup by Batista, the Moncada barracks assault, the defeat of that, but the victory out of defeat, the building of the July 26th movement, the Granma expedition, the exile in Mexico, the Granma expedition, the Revolutionary War, which combined with the mass urban underground working class movement led to the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, and then Fidel leading a socialist revolution. We went through that period. So and the last class, we ended it at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's where we're at. The Cuban Missile Crisis takes place, and it's resolved.
And did he criticize other, like with Mao, for example? How did he get involved in terms of when the Soviet Union, broke up and the new countries came to be? Where did he side with that? Did he stay? Every country has their own, development, and how did he handle that?
The Soviet Union withdraws missiles from Cuba without the missiles that they imposed really on Cuba, convinced the Cubans to put in there. They were pulled out. Cuba got a unwritten promise that the United States wouldn't invade, which it didn't on the form of another Bay of Pigs invasion, but at the same time there was terrorism, stepped up activities which have never stopped to this day, have had ups and downs against Cuba. So in this period, the Cubans felt that their best defense was to extend the Cuban Revolution, especially in the Americas, which at that time was a boiling over with oppressive military regimes, grotesque inequality, rises in the class struggles, all kinds of urban uprisings and so on throughout the 50s and in the 60s. Then the Cuban Revolution hits the scene in the Americas and inspires a whole generation of revolutionary youth. The Cuban foreign policy at that time is focused on, this we're talking about the early 60s through the death of Che, is focused on building a continental revolutionary movement. And Che, when he goes to Bolivia, has this approach of organizing guerrillas with a focus on Bolivia and making alliances and having a continental strategy to link up these different struggles. However, the United States had learned lessons from the Cuban Revolution and was immediately set counterinsurgency forces and these things. And at the same time, within the Americas, there was in 1964 the military coup in Brazil, which was largely carried out, organized, backed by the CIA, because the Goulart regime, which was a progressive, not a revolutionary regime, but had friendly relations with Cuba and refused to break diplomatic relations with Cuba. So they were overthrown by the CIA, 64. The counterinsurgency, so all these right-wing military dictatorships began to build up their counterinsurgency forces, and then there was the betrayal and the defeat of Che and the murder of Che in 1967. And this was accompanied in the years before and in the years immediately afterward with basically the defeat and the crushing of guerrilla movements throughout this period in the 1960s in Peru, in Argentina, which eventually led to the military dictatorship there later, in Venezuela, attempts at armed struggle in Uruguay, the defeat of the Tupamaros, and in Brazil, as I said, there was a military coup, and then there were later struggles there. So this was a period when the revolutionary foreign policy of Cuba, where they were promoting revolutionary struggles against these regimes, led to a series of defeats and the murder of Che. And it was at this time that the Cuban leadership was also coming under tremendous economic pressure from the United States, was total diplomatic isolation in Latin America. After the coup in Brazil, the only government in the Americas, in all of the America, the Caribbean, Central America, Latin America, there was only one government that did not bow to the U.S. pressure to break diplomatic ties with Cuba, and that was Mexico. And part of that deal was that Mexico allowed, because they felt politically, because of the traditions of the Mexican Revolution and so on, that they weren't able to do that politically, but they did allow the CIA to have a big base in Mexico where they would spy on the Cubans and so forth. So in that isolation, they had this big campaign, and in this period of the 1960s, they clashed, as I mentioned, I think in the last class, with the more pro-Moscow oriented communist parties of Latin America, which had sometimes very normal and even friendly diplomatic relations with the same governments that were murdering the guerrillas and so on. And there's a number of books. I didn't bring this one. I had it here the last time. A book called Fidel Castro Speaks. It's out of print now. It was printed in the 60s by, I think, Vintage. And it has a number of the speeches by Fidel in that period where they really excoriate some of these other communist parties. And in Bolivia, the Bolivian Communist Party, which had quite a following in the working class among coal miners and other miners, had originally agreed to support and help lead at the equivalent of a revolutionary underground, which Che's strategy was always that any rural guerrilla campaign would have to have a component, like the Cuban Revolution did, of an urban revolutionary underground. Would have to be underground because these were dictatorships where there was no legal political space to work. And if you read Che's classic guerrilla warfare book, one of the things he points out is that if there's any space for political activity, even under a corrupt regime, that even it holds phony elections, but if that means that there's any space that you could function, that means that the conditions for launching an armed struggle are not right. But in many Latin American countries, those were the conditions, and they had done that. So late 60s, the Cuban economy is under tremendous stress. Their guerrilla allies have been crushed. The Che has been murdered. And in 1968 was also a period when in the Vietnam War, where the U.S. escalation, which this was a very dear question to the Cubans, had reached even 500,000 troops. So in this period, in order to maintain, to build the economy and so on under these conditions, the Cubans launched a campaign to harvest 10 million tons of sugar, which at that time was their major export and item that they could use to trade for manufactured products, industrial products, and so on. That campaign, although it produced 8.5 million tons, also failed. And this was another big blow. So a lot of these pressures led the Cubans to be in a position where they became, again, more dependent on the Soviet Union and so on in terms of maneuvering. So at the same time, they're sort of pausing. They weren't prepared to go back to the guerrilla orientation, the armed struggle orientation that had developed in the 60s, but they still were looking for revolutionary opportunities. They were looking for openings where they could promote a revolutionary agenda. And what came along in 1973 was the tremendous upsurge in Chile. And this was an example of a government that got elected in 1970, the Allende government, and immediately it was elected with about 37% of the vote in an election that was split between the Chilean Unidad Popular, which was basically an alliance of the two mass working class parties that existed in Chile at that time, the Socialist Party, which Allende was the leader of, and the Communist Party, which was also a very a mass working class party. And then there was the bourgeois parties, the Christian Democrats, which were more liberal, and the more reactionary party, they were split. So you had a three-way race, and Allende got a plurality of the vote. And when he was elected, this led to a massive upsurge and created political space for the working class and its allies in Chile. And the government became more and more popular and began to chip away more and more. By the time of the last congressional elections before the coup, they had gotten up to 44% of the vote in the Unidad Popular coalition. This government began to institute very important reforms. There was land reforms, nationalization of the copper industry, which is a very big foreign exchange earner in Chile and so on. There's a tremendous story. I could give a whole lecture just on Chile, which was one of the biggest defeats for the working class movement since, Hitler's smashing of the German workers' movement. This is a wonderful DVD called The Battle of Chile, which is considered one of the great documentaries of all time, even by people that aren't that political. It's an amazing film, which you might be able to find on Amazon or Netflix or somewhere, or even buy it if you had to in the old format of the DVDs. But it's worth seeing. It's a three-part series. It was actually filmed while the coup was taking place. The final finishes of it, the coup took place. There's even a famous scene in there where one of the cameramen working for the director, who was a brilliant Chilean documentary filmmaker, Guzman, was filming during the day of the coup, and the cameraman actually got shot and killed, and you can see him being killed with his camera by one of the military goons. The film was smuggled out of Chile after the coup and was finished in Cuba with the Cuban film cooperative ICEC, which is a brilliant Cuban film cinema, which is another I could talk about forever. But anyway, so the second disc in this is called The Strike of the Bourgeoisie, because what happened in Chile is the sort of the bourgeois forces in Chile just withdrew and did everything they could to sabotage the economy. Some of you have probably read some of the accounts, and now in the great American tradition, after they overthrow some government or do some nasty shit, you know, they release under the Freedom of Information Act, and you can actually see the documents of how they did it. They preserved it and all that, which they certainly shows that the U.S. was involved in the coup on every level and in the sabotage. So now the important thing is that Fidel went to Chile. Chile established diplomatic relations with Cuba. They developed friendly relations. They were one of the first ones to break that diplomatic isolation. And Nixon and Kissinger hated Chile for that and were determined to overthrow the Allende government, if only for that reason. Now, Fidel went to Chile in 1971-72, spent many months there. This is a book you can get online. It's really more of a pamphlet. It's put out by Pathfinder Press. This is a wonderful compilation, uncensored, in his own words, of Fidel's speeches, interviews, press conferences. It's really a master class in trying to warn the Unidad Popular government of what was coming, that a polarization and a class showdown would be taking place. Unfortunately, and this film documents this, there were legions of workers that were demanding, wanted arms. They could see the coup coming, and the Allende government was stuck to constitutional legality. Unfortunately, the Chilean military did not do that as well, and the coup took place, and really as many as 10,000 people were murdered in the days following the coup. Torture was rampant, and this was a huge defeat. And so this is I always say this is a negative example of Fidel's Marxist world outlook, in the sense that as a Marxist, Fidel understood that this class polarization was not going to be able to be bridged, and that a defeat on the scale of what happened would set back the workers' movement for a long period of time. This is really a law of the class struggle and of history. You know, if you look back on history and you see major events, and this comes back in the next section we're discussing, which is Southern Africa, but this is a law. When Hitler defeated the German workers' movement and crushed, you know, the remnants of bourgeois democracy in Germany, that was not overturned. I mean, that was just a whole defeat, which lasts a whole epoch. Franco in Spain, Suharto in Indonesia. Whenever the revolutionary movement or the workers' movement has a chance to take power and it doesn't do it and is defeated in that type of situation for whatever reason, you can't just instantly recover from that. It takes a whole epoch, you know, and you can have people that are keeping the revolutionary spirit alive, but that's not enough. So this is what happened in Chile. We'll see when we get to Southern Africa that this was the opposite happened, where the victory was able to prevent that kind of world defeat. So we go to Southern Africa. So the defeat in Chile is in September 11th, 1973. In 1974, an officers' coup takes place in Portugal of low-level officers who are fed up with the colonial wars that Portugal has been carrying out for almost centuries in Southern Africa, in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. And these regimes are decrepit because this is an empire that began, it's like a semi-feudal empire, and it's just too much for the weak capitalist state, one of the weakest capitalist states in Europe, Portugal, to have such an empire. And it began to hollow out and decay from within. And so these junior officers overthrew the Salazar regime, which was a semi-fascist regime that had been allied to Franco and Hitler and had been kept in power by imperial. But they overthrew it. And these officers were very progressive-minded, and tremendous political space opened up in Portugal. And the very first thing that was done was to say, we're getting the hell out of Africa. And we're the pressure to dissolve these colonial structures and to win independence. And there were already liberation movements, Frelimo, in Southern Africa and in Angola, the MPLA, and other groups that had been fighting for independence. And these groups got tremendous impetus. The strongest, most multinational was a group called the MPLA. And they were the Portuguese said, we're giving independence, I think November 11th, 1976. This is Independence Day. South Africa, still ruled by the apartheid state, covertly backed by the United States, but not able to be too open because of political factors in the United States. But nevertheless, so they decide this is not acceptable. There's no way that we can have an independent government on our border that is allied to Cuba, that is not a U.S. allied regime, that's neutral, that's part of the non-aligned movement, that also has friendly relations with the Soviet Union. So they began to organize an invasion force, and they were going to overthrow that government. And they said, troops going, and they had, of course, the most mechanized, the most powerful military in the entire African continent was the apartheid regime's military. And they were on the verge on the gates of Lisbon, on the gates of Luanda, at the time of the day that independence was going to be declared. And the Angolan government, which of course was guerrilla forces that had fought guerrilla warfare, they had not built up a modern army. They were really in no position to resist this invasion. That wasn't just theoretical. The troops were moving and on the border and ready to cross over. So they appealed to the Soviet Union for help. The Soviet Union said, no, we're not interested in doing anything before independence is declared. There's a wonderful documentary film called Cuba and Africa. It's a French production, I think. Excellent film. You can find that, I know, is on Netflix or Amazon. And the Cuban representative, a wonderful revolutionary fighter, he said, we are ready. The Soviets may not be ready, but we are ready. And the Cubans sent, this is one of the most amazing acts of selfless internationalism in the history of the workers' movement and the internationalist movement. They sent thousands by ship, by plane, by transport of troops right to the gates of Luanda to meet the South African forces and to push them back, which they did. This was unprecedented. The whole account, the best account is, you can look it up on the internet, by the Nobel Prize winning author Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was also a great journalist. He wrote an account called Operation Carlotta. It was originally published, I think, in all places, Rolling Stone magazine back in 1970, whatever it was, 76, 77. But you can find it on the internet everywhere. It's a fantastic essay on how they did this. Operation Carlotta. Carlotta, do you remember when we were in Cuba? Carlotta was a slave, a woman who led a slave uprising in Matanzas, Cuba, in the 1830s. That was a mass uprising of slaves organized by Carlotta, who was captured and murdered, but who's an inspiring figure. Anyway, that was the operation was named after her. In the course of the next 12 years, until the defeat of the South Africans at the Battle of Cuito-Cunavale, the Cubans had 370,000 troops, not all at once, but volunteers served in this. That includes 370,000 troops and 50,000 doctors and civilians. Over 2,000 Cuban troops died because for many years after they were pushed back from Luanda, there was wars that were going on, incursions, battles, and this is intricately and intimately tied to the growing mass struggle in South Africa. In 1976 is the youth uprising at Soweto, 600, 700 people murdered in the streets, but leading to a mass explosion and the growth of the ANC, the revolutionary movement in South Africa, and South Africa becoming more or less ungovernable. And at the same time, the South African army is stretched out, fighting the Cubans here and there over many years. This culminates in the late 1980s in the decisive battles where the Cubans defeated, and their Angolan and Namibian and South African allies defeated in battle the white South African army. And this was, this was the first time, this was a mostly all African army that did this. So the psychological impact of this, for the first time, it showed that the apartheid army, which also had a lot of drafted African troops, but totally led and officered by white South Africans, could be defeated. And this was extremely important, so you can see what Mandela said that many times, that this was the decisive factor in the defeat. And again, this was done for nothing. The Cubans say this was, we left with nothing but the bodies of our fallen comrades. No gold, no silver, no deals. And Angola, is a oil-rich country. So, but nothing like that. This was an example of what I was talking about before. We look at Chile as an example of Fidel's foresight. At this moment, if you can think, this was the defeat of South Africa, which led by 1988 and then the early 90s to the unraveling of the apartheid regime, because they were forced to grant independence to Namibia. They were forced eventually to release Mandela, to unban the ANC, to negotiate the end of apartheid in a sense. I mean, concessions were made on the other side, and that's a whole question. But the future of the African continent, if you look at the African continent today with its relative growth in political unity, relative development, relative space, the rise of Africa in its weight in the world, this is all flows from this period where the main bulwark of imperialism in South Africa, which was the apartheid state, was defeated. And that was a huge advance for working people in South Africa and throughout the entire African continent. But if Fidel had the foresight to see that if this had not happened, if the Portuguese had been able to win, if the U.S. backed and South African forces in Angola, Namibia, in this whole period, Ronald Reagan, I mean, I don't think I'm giving the full impact of what this meant, this war in Southern Africa. Because in Southern Africa, at that time, Reagan, who was the president, unleashed the Renamo group in Mozambique that maybe killed conservatively 500,000, 1 million people, laid waste to the country. In Angola, they supported the Savimbi and Holden Roberto, who were like, it was a total creation of the CIA. Savimbi was allied with South Africa. It was devastating. At the same time they were doing the Contra War in Nicaragua. It was very devastating impact in Southern Africa. But they were defeated. And Fidel knew that if that did not happen, it would have set in a whole epic. Can you imagine the African continent, the map of Africa politically today, if that had not happened? Now, go back for a second. I forgot to mention when we're talking about what did happen in Chile, that ushered in further the period that was called the Condor Years. That was an alliance of all of these right-wing military dictatorships in Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, where they set up an operation called Operation Condor, where they assassinated opponents of the regime, unleashed death squads. The diplomat Orlando Letelier, people may remember his case in Washington, D.C., murdered on the streets of Washington, D.C., had been a Chilean diplomat in Washington that was supported Allende. So this was a very dark period in Latin American history that began to unravel around the same time as the defeats in Southern Africa. So, these are some of the Cuban troops. I mentioned went. So around this period, there also, we talk about Chile, but in the South American continent, it was a series of defeats, which I just mentioned. But at the same time, in Central America, there'd be the big revolutionary upsurge. And this went on, and this is a collection of Fidel's speeches from this period, War and Crisis in the Americas, which I would really strongly recommend. That was a very rich period. It was highlighted by the victorious Sandinista Revolution in 1979. That in turn led to the establishment. If people remember from the last class, we went into the question from a theoretical perspective of the idea of a workers' and farmers' government. You remember we talked about in Cuba, unlike, say, some of the processes we've seen recently in Latin America where progressive governments get elected. In Cuba, there was a revolutionary war, which the old institutions of the old neo-colonial state dissolved in the course of the revolutionary struggle. The police, the courts, the army, and the whole apparatus of repression that makes up a state. So in Nicaragua, it was a similar process because it was an armed struggle. The Somoza dictatorship was overthrown through an armed struggle, and the revolutionaries in power dissolved the old police, the old army, the old court system, and began to build up institutions that were in the interests of the workers and peasants. And this is what happened for many years. And the reforms, the same campaigns around illiteracy, the expansion of culture, the expansion of healthcare, with the help of Cuba, which helped with doctors, but the cause for people that, I see a few folks that are maybe not as old as me, but probably went through that period, you know, that it was a very inspiring. It's like Venezuela was in our lifetimes, or things like that. It's just a very inspiring thing. Youth would go down to Nicaragua to help and stuff, and it was a. But of course, it led to the U.S. Contra War, and this was devastating to Nicaragua. Although they defeated the Contras militarily, the country was so exhausted by the war that it created tremendous pressure on the Sandinista government, and there were debates. Could they go further? How would they deal with questions of land reform? What would they do with all these returning soldiers that came back after the war? How would they do land? And there was a lot of indecision and erosion of support because of the conditions of the war and so on, and it eventually led to the defeat of the Sandinistas in elections, but a lot of the revolutionary fervor of the early years had eroded by that time and so on. That's a very important question in terms of Nicaragua, but I'm going to move on because we've got a lot to cover to the Grenada. There was another great revolution in the Caribbean in a black English-speaking country that had a huge impact. Maurice Bishop, brother here, took power in a revolutionary movement against the Gary dictatorship. Again, another workers and farmers government began to establish tremendous reforms in the interests of working people in Grenada, and had a big impact throughout the Caribbean. And this time, the revolutionary process was destroyed from within. There was a coup led by a faction by a man named Bernard Cord that actually, in their own bubble, that a sectarian existence that they had and factional existence, actually murdered Maurice Bishop and some of the leaders of the Grenada Revolution, and this was a huge defeat. So this revolutionary upsurge, there had been guerrilla struggles in El Salvador that led to a non-conclusive conclusion. The armed struggle didn't win. The government didn't win. They made some. There was pressure to carry out peace talks. So basically, the revolutionary upsurge in that period was either defeated or neutralized, and that was in that period. And the Cubans had gone from great revolutionary prospects to again seeing a series of defeats. This laid the basis for, because a few years later the Soviet Union collapsed, there was all the Cold War propaganda, that the U.S. had won the Cold War, and the end of socialism, the end of history, whatever. And in this period led to the long sort of neoliberal decade or less in Latin America that sort of was ushered in by the victory of the military dictatorship in Chile. And the Pinochet brought in the University of Chicago economists, the Chicago boys, I think they called them, and began, of course it's easier to do when you have a full dictatorship. You can sort of just impose these neoliberal austerity measures. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is the question of Stalin and Stalinism. This has been, as people know, an arsenal in the propaganda against socialism, Marxism, and communism by propagandists for imperialism and for capitalism, is the crimes that did take place in the Soviet Union and the policies there, and to try to identify that with what happened with anybody that tries to present a socialist program or even a social democratic program or whatever. So in this period, as we discussed in the last classes, Cuba was allied with the Soviet Union and was dependent in some ways, although they struggled to maintain their political independence. But so they were not in a position, they sort of had to be necessarily circumspect on a lot of things that they differed from the Soviet Union, and the practice of the Cuban differed from them. So they couldn't really sometimes say everything that they thought or felt about the policies. For example, on the Vietnam War in particular was something that the Cubans were very upset that the Soviet Union and China were fighting each other and doling out aid to Vietnam and so on. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, which the Fidel and the Cubans saw coming, this, as we will discuss further, as we alluded to, I think in the Q&A the last time, that this had a terrible impact on the Cuban economy. The Cuban economy by that time was carrying out almost 85% of their trade with the Soviet Union and allied Eastern European countries. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed and the so-called socialist camp and all the Eastern European countries that Cuba had carried out relations with, this not only, it was a devastating blow economically, and we'll get to that, but in a strange irony of history kind of way, it was a very liberating politically for them, in the sense that they could now talk more openly about the contrast between their practice and that of the Soviet Union, and talk more openly about some of the problems that they had, including in terms of economic relations. And they began to talk out more clearly. And the things that I'm going to cite in the next few slides are examples of Fidel. In fact, in this interview with Tomás Borge, who was a leader of the Sandinistas, he goes into detail on his thoughts about Stalin and Stalinism, going back to the time of the Soviet Union, the rise of the consolidation of power by Stalin, and many things like that, where he talked more openly about that he had done. So among the things that he talks about was the fact that in the Cuban Revolution, where it was never the question of socialist legality was very important, and that he has strong criticisms and in these interviews that he talks about the purges and the murder of many communists, the disregard of socialist legality. This man here is a guy named Tukhachevsky. He was the head of the Red Army. He was a brilliant military leader. He had been elevated in the army at the time when Trotsky was the head of the army, who was, of course, an anathema by then. But he was one of the brilliant innovators in terms of military theory. He understood that the next wars would be mobile wars, things like this. He was, the Nazis, Hitler, had a disinformation campaign where they sent out false documents and stuff, and knowing how paranoid Stalin was, they arrested him and framed him up for being a German agent, and that led to a tremendous purge of the Red Army in the mid-1930s, where literally thousands, they say something like maybe 70, 80% of the officers and the higher commands were not just demoted, but were actually executed, including Tukhachevsky. This is a chart that shows the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party at the time of the revolution, and that by the 1930s, by the late 1930s, after the purges, every single one of them had been executed, or in the case of Trotsky, was assassinated in 1940. He had gotten out of the country before the purges started. So that's an example of that. So Fidel stressed in these interviews and so on, you know, that the question of socialist legality, that there was never anybody tortured, executed. There were executions, but there was trials and these things of counter-revolutionaries, not frame-ups. And he had strong opinions on this and wrote about it and get in these interviews. The forced collectivization of agriculture is another distinction between the Soviet Union and the practice in the Soviet Union and in Cuba. So I want to read a quote here, a couple of quotes from Fidel. He says, first on the question of legality on Stalin, he says, I was more critical of Stalin because of some of his mistakes. He was to blame, in my view, for the invasion of the USSR in 1941 by Hitler's powerful war machine without the Soviet army ever hearing a call to arms. Stalin also committed serious errors. Everyone knows about his abuse of force, the repression, and his personal characteristics, the cult of personality. He says, his terrible distrust of everything made him commit several other mistakes. One of them was falling in the trap of German intrigue and conducting a terrible bloody purge of the armed forces and practically beheading the Soviet Union on the eve of the war. Then on forced collectivization, he said some of Stalin's worst mistakes were in agricultural policy and forced collectivization of farms. It seems to me that which never happened in Cuba, it seems to me that the process of socialization of the land should have been started earlier and developed progressively. It seems to me that the attempt to socialize the land in an extremely short period of time historically by means of violence was very costly both economically and in terms of human suffering. That was a serious mistake under Stalin's leadership. What I don't believe is that anything forced them to have then carried out an accelerated process of compulsory collectivization. We've always understood that small plots of land have limited production possibilities, but we never engaged in any compulsory collectivization. And to this day, there are hundreds of thousands of private farmers in Cuba. So, here's my little thing here. So, another one is the question of art and culture. I raise these things because these are all part of the theme of what we're talking about today, which is resolving the question of revolutionary leadership in the world. Because all of us, I see a number of young people here, people that are veterans of struggles. Most of us here, I think, are engaged in struggles, labor struggles, struggles for whatever, against police killings, all the struggles in this beehive of activity here in the People's Forum, and the struggles that we're involved in. The question comes up in all of these things is the question of revolutionary leadership, because mass uprising. You look at Latin America, look at the world today. You pick up a newspaper. Everywhere you look, there's uprisings in Lebanon, in Chile, in Ecuador, mass struggles. And the question is, what kind of, if it's like steam that's just, it can be dissipated, or if you can forge out of that, like Fidel did in the Cuban Revolution, a selfless group of cadre of leaders that can link to the mass struggles and lead to a victory as the other side begins to organize its forces. So this is a very important distinction also. By the time, even though the early years of the Russian Revolution saw, like every genuine revolution, an incredible flourishing of art, culture, new art forms, the Cubists, if you look at some of the early Soviet art and the poster art and the film art, which a lot of it's been ripped off by Madison Avenue, some of those same designs and stuff, because they were so brilliant artistically. But by the mid-1930s, there was an official art in the Soviet Union. You know, the Matisses and all those great paintings were stored away in the storerooms of the Hermitage and weren't really shown much. Hermitage in Leningrad. And you know, it was really big. If you could draw great landscapes showing peasants heaving the thing and all that, you know, they came up with some brilliant stuff, but it was like socialist realism. This became like an imposed art form. And literature and novels, if they strayed into, you know, too surreal stuff. So this was the complete opposite of the Cuban Revolution. Now, the Cuban Revolution was under siege from the United States, and a lot of times the United States would try to find some artist or claim somebody an artist and say they're being censored. But in the Cuban Revolution, the slogan that encapsulated the position on art and culture was, this is from Fidel, within the revolution everything, outside and against the revolution nothing. In other words, nobody cared. And if you look at Cuban art, and this has always been the case in terms of forms, and I gave a couple examples, art forms, styles, all of that, even if you didn't have to be political or whatever, you know, as long as, if it wasn't something that was used, you know, to attack the revolution, and you put yourself in the service of the U.S. in the context of a war against Cuba, then you couldn't expect that the revolution was going to give you a platform to do that. But there was no censorship in style and art. There was a period in the 1970s, which is a different when there was conflict between some bureaucrats in Cuba, and there was some, but that was overcome within a few years. So this is the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which Fidel considered to be a huge mistake, and he said, I'm going to read you a little quote on this, because this becomes very important in Cuban politics in this period. So he says, so his views were particularly sharp on this question. He said, I was 13 when World War II began, and I read all the newspapers. I had been avidly reading all the newspapers, all the international news, ever since the Spanish Civil War. I read the newspapers in the years preceding war. Stalin did something that I will always criticize, because I think it was a flagrant violation of principle. His seeking peace with Hitler at all costs to gain time. In our long revolutionary life, and in the already relatively long life of the Cuban Revolution, we have never negotiated even one principle to gain time or obtain any other kind of practical advantage. All my life, ever since I developed a political and revolutionary awareness, I have considered that pact to have been a terrible mistake in Soviet foreign policy. It was a mistake in terms of principles and international opinion. And then he goes on to say that, and this is I think this is correct, as somebody that studied World War II a lot. He says, the things I mentioned go contrary to the doctrine and political wisdom. Even though it is true that the Soviet Union had a year and 9 months between September 39 and June 1941 in which to rearm, the one who made him, so there's a period of the Stalin-Hitler Pact, 39 to 41, June 22nd, 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, breaks the pact. He said if Hitler had gone to war against the Soviet Union in 1939, he would have done less damage than in June 1941. He made another extremely serious mistake in June 1941, with Stalin he's talking about, when the Germans had concentrated millions of soldiers, thousands of planes, tens of thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, and hundreds of divisions along the border. Faced with such clearly aggressive intentions, it was impossible to disguise them. Stalin clung to the theory that it was an act of provocation and acted like an ostrich sticking his head in the sand. He didn't mobilize the troops. So what happens? Hitler launched a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. How do you launch a surprise attack with millions of soldiers? Well, it was done, and Hitler attacked a country that wasn't mobilized. And the result was 25 million dead in the Soviet Union before they finally defeated. So, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Again, this was the period, as I mentioned earlier, when Cuba was under tremendous pressure. And in this period, at the same time that the United States was escalating the Vietnam War, a government had come to power in Czechoslovakia, a government that called it, that was a government of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, a reform wing that began to carry out, certain reforms in terms of democratic rights, space, cultural reforms, and so on, within the system. But it was carrying out a dynamic, it inspired people, and at the same time it was championed by the West and by the United States, and for trying to intervene in that and to try to take political advantage of it, which created a confusing situation. So that when the Soviets invaded and put in a government that was more amenable to it, this resulted in some resistance, which was eventually crushed. And there was a lot of pressure on Cuba. Most of the communist parties of Europe denounced it. This was denounced by most left-wing intellectuals around the world. It was and everybody was waiting. What is Fidel going to say? Because the Cuban Revolution had had an attraction. And so Fidel, under all this pressure, because of the conditions that I had mentioned earlier, the economic conditions, the defeat of all the guerrillas, the more dependence on the Soviet Union, Fidel came out with a statement, a speech that you could look up on the University of Texas archive that I referred to. And it was an interesting speech. The bottom line was he endorsed reluctantly the Soviet invasion. But it was such a he blasted Soviet policy that so much that the Soviets never even printed the support. But nevertheless, that was a position, and he goes back to this question in the book, My Life, which I've referred to as his sort of interview autobiography. So this again became an important marker. So in 1991, the Soviet Union Eastern Europe, most of the governments there had fallen. The Soviet Union was about to collapse. And in this period, the first democratically elected government in Brazil took power and it was led by a right-wing, multimillionaire, sort of scion of a very rich family, corrupt guy that ran all the, sort of like the Fox News of Brazil, that family. But nevertheless, it was the first democratically, more or less, elected government. A lot of people claim that he stole it from Lula even back then. But nevertheless, this government, and they had an inauguration, and it was a big deal. So Fidel went to the inauguration as part of the diplomatic offensive in Cuba to break out of their isolation. And by this time they had almost completely broken out of it, and most had diplomatic relations. So when Fidel went to Brazil, it was at this period when the Soviet Union was collapsing and so on. And Brazil, he had all these amazing meetings there with liberation theology groups, with teachers, with trade unionists, and so on. And he spoke again, probably more closely on what was going on in the Soviet Union and the alternative that the Cuban Revolution represented. And so I want to give a few quotes there. This is from a meeting he had with a Christian-based community in 1990 with liberation theologians. He says, somebody asked him about the Gorbachev's policy of perestroika, and didn't they need to do something like that in Cuba, have an opening, a democratic process? And Fidel said, we had already begun our process of rectification of errors and negative tendencies. Naturally, our process couldn't be the same as that of the USSR because we didn't make the same mistakes they made. We made other mistakes of a different kind, and we had to rectify them. because doing the things they did over there would have been like removing a corn with a remedy prescribed for a toothache. We didn't have phenomena like those stemming from Stalinism in our country. That never occurred, and neither did abuse of authority. For at certain historical moments, highly negative, violent processes against peoples took place in the Soviet Union. We've never used violence against even a single one of our citizens. We'd never stooped to doing that, because the day we did such a thing, using torture, committing crimes, we'd be outraged ourselves. There's never been a case of political crime in our country. We had revolutionary laws, revolutionary courts, revolutionary trials, and even spies. Terrorists who were executed with due process, but we never laid a finger on anybody to make him speak or tell anything. That hasn't stopped people from spreading the most atrocious and infamous lies about our country, but obviously great abuse of authority took place at certain times in the USSR, and there were phenomena which did not exist in Cuba. So there were many other things in there, and in my essay here, which people can get, is more quotes from that. So this relates again to the, we referred to this, in 2005, Fidel gave this speech at the University of Havana, which is a long speech. Whoops, what happened here? Oh, and it's considered in Cuba one of his main legacy speeches. And I want to quote about the period that we talked about a little bit, about the impact on Cuba and why, and this is an example of he's talking about resolving the crisis of revolutionary leadership. He says, we were speaking of the importance of the ethical factor. We would have to research the reasons for the confusion. I believe that historical events influence the idea that for a communist, the end justifies the means. There were international events that were difficult to understand. There was a precedent of France and Britain, those two great colonial powers, and the greatest in the world, attempting to hurl Hitler against the USSR. I think that the plans to throw Hitler against the USSR would have never justified the pact made between Hitler and Stalin. It was a very hard blow. The Communist parties, well known for their discipline, were obliged to defend the pact, and it cost them tremendous support around the world because that was discredited. Now he talks about Cuba. Before the pact, the necessity for unification in the anti-fascist struggle led to the alliance in Cuba of the Cuban Communists with Batista. By then, Batista had suppressed the famous strike of April 1932 that followed his coup against the provisional government. And then in 1944, the Cuban Communist Party, renamed the Popular Socialist Party, actually joined the Batista government. And that discredited them, and that vacuum is what led to the revolutionary youth that bypassed the CP and developed into the July 26 movement. So there was always, even though they merged later with the remnants of the CP, and the CP had joined in the guerrilla struggle in 1958, there was always that Fidelista core that had come tracing back to those periods. Okay, so the last thing I want to go into is the last period of Fidel's active political life, and until his death in 2016, the last revolutionary triumphs. The Cubans like to say that when Fidel died, the slogan developed that Fidel was the undefeated, because of, since Moncada at least, that he won almost every struggle that he directly was involved in. So I want to go a couple of these. The special period, I think I've gone into, these are some of the charts here about tremendous difficulties, the collapse of the economy, 35% decline. By comparison, the U.S. economy during the Great Depression, I think, declined 20% or something like that. Blackouts all the time, surgery done in the daylight because electricity would go out, so they'd have to do major surgeries like that. These are oxen that were replacing tractors that they had no parts for, something like that. Yeah. This had a good side to it in a sense. Some people argue anyway that it forced the Cubans to become more organic, so it's like a lot of things, the dialectic of history. I spoke to Cubans that told me that during this special period, the Cuban, the caloric intake went down. Nobody starved or anything like that, but as a result, a lot of people lost a lot of weight. They walked more, bicycles became very big, and all of a sudden the diabetes went way down. And then when they started to come out of it, and they started getting more processed food, some from the United States that they had to pay cash for, that some of these things went up again. So, you know, there's always that irony. So leading out of that, and at that time, Cubans, you know, this was a huge challenge. This was a country that throughout the 1970s and 80s had this structural relationship with the Soviet Union that was very beneficial. They had fixed prices for their goods. They could send sugar to get manufactured products in return. It may not have been the best quality, and so on and so forth, but, you know, things functioned. You know, standard of living went up. They were able to finance the social conquest, health, education, and so on. When that happened, they were not, you know, that had a devastating effect. But they rebuilt the tourist industry. Squads of construction workers, volunteer workers, they would build up these hotels. They realized that the one thing that they could do to get foreign exchange, to keep the social programs going, was to bring in foreign exchange from tourism. So overnight, brigades of construction workers would build these nice hotels, and they could start recruiting. They would have teams of revolutionary cadre going out, trying to find somebody that had capital, you know, a business or an investor or an individual capitalist or a state entity or something that could invest in Cuba, that could begin to rebuild distribution networks, all these things that had collapsed in this period. In the middle of, while they're leading this fight to get out of the special period, to put that behind them, the case of Elian Gonzalez electrifies the country and becomes a unification, because here's a man whose child was taken from him, who's liberated, discovered, and given to these counter-revolutionary, anti-revolutionary families. There's this spectacle every day, the Castro regime and this child escaping from communism, and the father just wouldn't go along with this scenario. He says, I want my child back, and I'm not defecting. And they tried everything. They tried to throw everything, and he wouldn't do it. And he was not. He was a modest worker in the tourism industry. And this is a case that riveted U.S. politics for quite a while, if people remember. And eventually, he was returned to his father, and this was a huge victory. And this was something that regalvanized popular struggles inside of Cuba. But this was a victory. The fight against the FTAA, Free Trade of the Americas Act. After NAFTA was passed, if people recall, the Bush administration and then the Clinton administration wanted to extend this to all of Latin America, to have this neoliberal regime that would devastate further working people do what NAFTA did to Mexican farmers and workers and the maquiladoras and everything. And this was their grand plan, and they had momentum for it. They had elected a neoliberal government in Argentina, Menem. There was a wave of these conservative governments. As I said, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the defeats of the Central American revolutions that led to all kinds of intellectuals, economists, political figures that had previously identified themselves as left-wing, moving to the right. Intellectuals like the guy that won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Vargas Llosa, Teodoro Petkov, a prominent intellectual in Venezuela that moved to the right, Jorge Castaneda, who I think he teaches at NYU now. He's become a very right-wing, used to be the Mexican foreign minister under Fox. These people that were sick, so they had momentum for this. Cuba led the fight against this. I remember the first time I started going back to Cuba after 1980, would go to these conferences. And this is the middle of the special period when they're on their backs. They would organize these conferences, bringing together trade unionists and others across the Americas to fight and eventually to create the conditions that defeated the FTA and that had to be withdrawn. the last, perhaps biggest victory of Fidel was the victory to free the Cuban Five. The Cuban Five, this is, we just had a event right here at the People's Forum on December 14th to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the freeing. These were 5 revolutionaries that had been assigned to go. They were intelligence operatives that had been assigned to monitor the terrorist activity of these right-wing groups, because as Cuba was getting out of a special period, building these hotels, building up the tourism industry, the right-wing forces in Cuba targeted that industry. This is when they passed Helmsburg. They set off bombs in hotels. An Italian tourist was murdered. There was sabotage. There was flights dropping, all these things, trying to lay the conditions to take advantage. They were clinking the champagne glasses when the special period broke out, literally in Miami. This right-wing Miami Herald columnist, a guy named Andres Oppenheimer. Some people might have had the torturous experience of having to read some of his columns. But he published a book. It was called, oh God, I'm forgetting. It was called like After Castro, or like, you know, I'll try to edit that in when we do the film, but he wrote a book that basically said he's going next year, he's coming down now, and they literally had champagne on ice. And in the course of this, the Cubans kept sending complaints formally to the FBI. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who I referred to earlier, who happened to have been a friend of both Fidel, a good friend of Fidel, and a friend of Bill Clinton, who admired his novels. And invited him to be a guest at the White House, and he brought with him a message from Fidel to Clinton saying, you know, these things are happening, these terrorist groups are doing it, we know this, and can you do something about it? They're breaking U.S. law, among other things, which is that, you know, you're not supposed to try to overthrow a foreign government, but they were basically supported or winked at by the FBI and the Aviation Administration and all of these things. And the U.S. refused to do anything about it. And in fact, they sort of used the initial contacts to try to figure out and step up there trying to figure out who the Cuban Five were. So, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what they did was they went in there to actually monitor, not to do anything, but just to monitor the activities of these groups. And they managed to prevent quite a few terrorist attacks, but eventually, and it's a story you can look up, it's a very inspiring story, the case of the Cuban Five, eventually they were arrested. There was a very, somebody's calling me here. There was a very, let me just turn this thing off here, sorry about that. Okay. There was a very big international campaign. We were very involved here in New York and in the United States. We eventually freed them after 16 years. 3 of them were freed. And then when Obama decided to retreat on U.S. policy and to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba, this was sort of a precondition from the Cuban side about this, and they were finally freed as a condition for the establishment of diplomatic relations. So this was one of Fidel's final victories. So that's pretty much it. I think we covered these things in the course of the thing, and I'll leave this on the background, and this can inform the Q&A. So thank you very much. I went a little bit over, but we can take some Q&As now. Thank you. No mic, so everybody's going to have to speak up. Go ahead.
You mentioned how astute Fidel was in terms of dealing with political, environment around him. And hearing about the critique of Stalin, but by that time Stalin was dead.
Sure.
How did he handle contemporary associates, and did he criticize other, with Mao, for example? How did he get involved in terms of when the Soviet Union, broke up and the new countries came to be? Where did he side with that? Did he stay you know, every country has their own, you know,
Sure.
development, and how do you handle it?
Well, the Cuban, you know, it's Fidel sometimes, and the Cuban leadership would have to, you know, they'd have to have a diplomatic hat and a head of state hat, and then the revolutionary hat. So, and it's not easy. They tried in the 1960s to build continental organizations, and they've always tried to build independent, revolutionary, or solidarity organizations. To this day, they organize things like that. But in terms of state-to-state relations, and Fidel was the head of state for many of these years, the ability to, you know, there's non-interference in other people's domestic affairs, but they would have their own opinions. For example, during the Vietnam War, as I mentioned, this was a very sharp problem that Che, Fidel, the division between the Soviet Union and China over that. And that reached a height in 1972, 73 during the Christmas bombings, and when Nixon, to try to get out of the origins of the U.S.-China relations over the last 40 years, when you look at them today, the origins of that was Nixon and Kissinger went to China to try to get the Chinese to put pressure on the Vietnamese to come to a diplomatic settlement. They were desperate for a way to present that they had ended the Vietnam War. And then they went to the Soviet Union, Nixon did, and clinked glasses with Brezhnev, and then they clinked glasses with Mao. And meanwhile, the Vietnamese are getting the hell bombed out of them by the United States. And they're having these meetings. So this was the closest I ever saw in the public press. I remember I was a college student at the time, and I remember reading the Cuban press at that time, and it was very sharp. And then when China invaded Vietnam in 1979, after the Vietnamese threw out the genocidal Pol Pot regime, China invaded, and the Cubans were not too happy about that. In that period, there was never a break of diplomatic relations, but there was a lot of tension, because under Deng Xiaoping in that period, and then really beginning under Mao and then under Deng Xiaoping, a lot of the policies of the Chinese in Angola, they supported the side that the MPLA was fighting against, and so on. So there were these tensions. Today, ironically, Cuba is more independent and more free to speak its mind on any issues than it has ever been. But at the same time, they are a small country of like less than 12 million people, and they're under attack. So their diplomacy is very important. I mean, at the end of the day, or in the final analysis, you know, the survival of the Cuban Revolution depends on its extension, you know, around the world. It depends on more allies. It depends on the advance of socialist property relations, socialist ideals in the world. But until that day comes, and they're doing everything to create the conditions to do that, but until that day comes, it's very important that they have these diplomatic relations, that they unite the entire United Nations every year against the blockade. What a feat that is if you think about it. You got Saudi Arabia and Iran voting for Cuba. You got North Korea and South Korea voting for Cuba. You got every regime that are at war with each other. You know, they all come together and denounce the blockade against Cuba, and that's very important. It doesn't take the place of new revolutionary governments in the world, but they do what they have to do. Yes.
Yeah. When I was in Cuba in the middle of last year, one thing I noticed was that, you know, there's this mythology about there being all old U.S., and there are a lot of old U.S. cars, but they're basically three major generations of cars. The old U.S. cars are there. Then there's, like, you know, Soviet era cars, and now most of this stuff is Asian, mostly Chinese.
Yes.
But one thing I noticed, and this is, I want you to explain because I don't understand, was there were some French cars, Renaults, and you know, fairly, not yesterday's model, but you know, fairly recent models. So, you know, why is that? Like, what? Because there were no German cars, say, or other European cars, but there were French.
Well, the Cubans have actually always, I mean, of all the Western European countries and advanced capitalist countries, they've probably had some of the closest economic relations with the French. I don't really know. I've noticed some French cars. I would assume they get them, you know, from retail salespeople, maybe in Panama or something like that. But you're right. The most cars that you see now are Chinese, Sealy's, and a lot of the buses, a lot of the locomotives, Chinese and Russian. And the old cars, it's sort of an interesting thing because there are a lot of them, and there still are people that use them for their everyday transportation. But what I see every time I go back to Cuba more and more is that there's an industry now of people really fancying up their cars, shining them. Sometimes they may even have a boat motor in it. I mean, the Cubans are the best probably auto mechanics in the world because they've had to improvise so much. But they it's like for tourists, and there's these clubs. I think it was Bravo, the cable TV channel, had a series a few years back. I think it was called Cuban Chrome. It was really interesting, you know, because it shows there's these clubs in Havana, and these guys are scrounging all over trying to find parts, and they're going over town and they trade this and making parts, and they do it. But yeah, their automobile fleet is modernizing, and their trade in general. In your broader point that you're making, the trade in general with Western Europe and so on is slowly expanding. But there's always the pressure because in today's globalized world and supply chains and first in time and all these structural changes in world capital flows and everything else, that it's hard to find a product anywhere that doesn't have some US components in it, and that automatically becomes then something that's subject to the blockade. The company that imports it is subject to losing their access to the huge US market, and there's very few capitalists, even the most progressive minded, or even the ones that just want to make a quick buck. If you can find some of those that they can make a reasonable profit in Cuba, but they have to decide. Like Scarrett is a Canadian company that mines nickel, among other things. Cuba happens to be, I think, the second largest source of nickel in the world, and nickel is a very important metal that's crucial for a lot of key ultra modern commodities that gets produced. And so Scarrett just decided, screw it, we're going to help with this. This is going to be our business. We're going to invest capital in it. We'll make a deal with the Cuban government and help modernize the mines and help train the workforce in the latest techniques and all of that. And in exchange, none of the executives from Scarrett can ever visit the United States. None of their companies can ever do any business with the United States. No, if they, and so on and so forth. And that's true with everything. So occasionally you can find a capitalist that has that much guts to do it, and you can make some money while they're at it. Same thing with some of these companies like Melia, which is a Spanish company that helped the Cubans build a lot of the hotels. And helped train management and did the management of these hotels in the early years while they were training the Cubans. Well, they had to make a decision. I once had dinner, I don't even remember, but we were talking to somebody that had once been a Melia salesperson or had been part of the Melia, his company had contracted out to them. And, they had to make a decision. Okay, if we do this for Cuba, we're cutting ourselves off from the U.S. market, and that's been the case. Right here and then right there. Go ahead.
During the period of the Vietnam War, do you recall Fidel ever getting in contact with Ho Chi Minh and having a photo op with him or something like that?
Fidel said that maybe the greatest regret of his life was not meeting Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh died in 1969. Fidel went to Vietnam, went to South Vietnam, went to liberated territory in South Vietnam in the 1970s. But after Ho had died, had met with Giap, General Yap and so on, but he never did meet Ho Chi Minh. But he was very inspired by the example of his life. And I think we can say for sure that when you look at that that heroic revolutionary period of the 1960s and 70s, that Vietnam was at the center of Cuban internationalism. That was their thought. Che's slogan when he, and I think I told the story last class, but I'll tell it again. You know, when Che was preparing for the Revolutionary War, first in the Congo, and then when he ended up in Bolivia, you know, he couldn't exactly hold a press conference and say, I'm going to Bolivia, we're going to start a guerrilla war, and we're going to overthrow all the right-wing military dictatorships in the continent. No, he went incognito, you know, he went underground, he disappeared, you know, he prepared his forces, he went into disguises, he slipped into Bolivia with looking like he was a doctor, he had documents, you know, all that stuff that you got to do stuff like that. And you know, so he goes to Bolivia and he sets this up. So the U.S. and the CIA, they had a program of disinformation that really employed hundreds of people that were in the State Department, the CIA, and these guys. I mean, you get a job. You know, you apply for a job at the CIA. You say, okay, what am I doing? Okay, your job is, you're going to be in this desk over here. Your job is to come up with bullshit and lies about Cuba every day and plant stories in the newspapers. This is what I'm not exaggerating. I've often thought I could make a comedy routine out of this, but this is what they did. And among the things that they would do would be to spread the rumor that Fidel had Che killed, that he was languishing in Cuban prisons and all of this. So I got to the point, it was such a campaign, and they even tricked quite a few leftists to say, where's Che? What's going on? And they would buy some of these lies that were being spread, some of this fake news. And finally, Fidel had to read a letter at one of these OLAS Organization of Latin American Solidarity, one of these conferences that were called of revolutionaries, and he read the letter that Che had sent, I think he was in Bolivia by that time, and the war outside, where he said, you know, he read, this is a famous letter, and in it he says, we must create 2-3 many Vietnams. And what they gave blood. They said, for Vietnam we will give our blood. They would do anything for Vietnam, because again, that's one of those moments in history that if you're a Marxist and a revolutionary socialist, you know, if the United States had succeeded in crushing Vietnam, in preventing its unification, what that would have meant for world politics in the next period. You know, so all of these, you get to these moments in history where a decisive battle, I would say today in Latin America, if you look at Venezuela, the stakes are high. Whatever criticisms anybody may have of the Maduro regime, but it's very clear that in Latin America today, if the U.S. had succeeded earlier this year in having a military coup, in organizing a victorious military coup, that would have been necessarily bloody. It would have been like Allende, like Chile times 10, because of the level of mobilization that had taken place. That would have, and this is what they're trying to do today, that would have laid the basis for a whole epic, a whole period of right-wing openings, and given a tremendous boost to those forces in Latin America. Yes, brother.
So, have he also tried to contact Nelson Mandela during deliberation
against Apartheid? Is there some kind of
connection
they had during that time? I know later on. After his release, Nelson Mandela's release. Was there like some sort of contact?
I think in Nelson Mandela's autobiography, if I remember correctly, which is a fabulous book, Long March to Freedom, I think messages were sometimes smuggled in. They knew when, for example, when Che died, they got news of that. They were able to get messages smuggled in, whether there was any direct contact between Fidel and Mandela. probably indirect contact, because the Communist Party and the armed struggle organization, Congo, you know, had people that were able to get into the prison and stuff like that. Of course, after Mandela was released, the very first place he went to was Cuba. The second place he went to was the United States because of the strong anti-apartheid movement in the United States. But the first place he went to was Cuba. And the quote that I have about what Mandela said, and they challenged him. They very much tried. I don't know if some of you may have seen that famous, or look it up on YouTube, the encounter with Ted Koppel when Mandela was freed. And he came and he spoke, I think it was at City College, if I'm not mistaken. Thousands of students attended to see Mandela, and Koppel's interviewing him. And Koppel's trying like crazy to get him to denounce Fidel and also Gaddafi and anybody that had aid. And he presses him, oh, Fidel Castro, and he wouldn't do it. And it's a beautiful thing to see. Look it up on YouTube. Just type in, you know, Ted Koppel, Nelson Mandela, Fidel Castro, and it's fantastic. But they became very close friends. And Fidel was invited to address the South African Parliament. He spoke at the Durban Anti-Racism Congress. That was very important. So they were very close friends and comrades. Yes?
You referred to a documentary, and the name of that was Cuba, an African Odyssey?
Yes.
Now I recommend that. People don't look that up. That's about the best you can get on Cuba and Africa. It's a very long. It's a couple of hours.
More than that.
Yeah, it's a little more than that. Yeah, but I highly recommend that. I think if we can get a hold of it, it can even be shown here. You know, that's another job for you. You know?
It is wonderful. Cuba, an African Odyssey. I think it's on Netflix, if I'm not mistaken. But you can look it up. It can be purchased for sure on Amazon. Has it, which is sort of ironic since Jeff Bezos comes from an anti-Cuban family. But in any case, he's got to make money. Anybody else that hasn't asked anything yet? Yes.
When Allende visited Fidel in Cuba, at the end of their visit, Fidel gave him a present. Can you talk about that?
I mean, when Fidel visited Chile, or?
No, when Allende visited.
Oh, you mean the machine gun? Well, yeah, I guess that way he was trying to tell him something about then too. But you really should check out in the Battle of Chile. Some of these scenes are just, they're inspiring on the one hand, but they're just so depressing because you know what ends up happening. But there's these assemblies of workers, industrial workers in the factories, you know, that have formed militias that see the coup coming and that they want arms. Give us arms to defend our factory, defend ourselves. And nothing came. You know, they never really thought that, I mean, you know, the Allende, I hate to say it because I admire Allende very much, but Pinochet was appointed by the Allende government, you know, to be the chief of staff because he was hoping, at the time, Pinochet was saying, of course, support the Constitution and blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, but there's a great tragedy. Yes?
Can I answer my own question?
Yeah, go ahead.
At the conclusion of their meeting, Fidel gave them a very high precision, lightweight machine gun. And Allende did use that in the palace as the soldiers were marching up the stairs at the end.
Yeah.
We killed a few.
Yes.
I read this someplace, and what were the circumstances? I heard that Fidel had an office in the Flatiron building. You ever heard anything about that?
No, I know that there's a apartment on Central Park West, I think, where Casa de las Americas was represented here today by my brother Jaime, the oldest Cuban-American pro-Cuba organization going back to the 50s when they organized meetings in New York, Connecticut, up down the East Coast with Fidel. And Fidel stayed, you know, most places somebody like Fidel, there's in fact there's a little campaign to put a plaque, these historical societies. I don't think they've done that yet for that apartment. But the New York Times, I remember, ran an article about sort of a walking tour of Fidel in New York. I don't remember the Flatiron Building, but there was definitely. Maybe I'm just not aware of it. But there was definitely New York City and Fidel have a real history. There's a movie coming out. I don't know the title of it yet. It stars a huge star. It's got a very big Hollywood print on it, and it's an Israeli who played Wonder Woman, a famous Israeli actress.
She's the current Wonder Woman?
Maybe, I'm not sure, because I'm not into the genre so much, but she's big. Anyway, she's going to play, there's a story of there was a journalist for ABC News, name was Lisa Howard. She's a very progressive journalist who interviewed Che when he came to the UN, and who became close friends with Fidel at that time. How close is a matter of speculation and blah, blah, blah. Some people, but in any case, she interviewed Fidel. They had a friendship that developed, and and she was driven. She died early. She was blacklisted from the news industry. She lost her job because she carried out. She was presenting more progressive views. And this has now become the basis for a movie that, according to what I've read, is going to be a sympathetic portrayal of some of this history. So we can look for. I wish I had more information to give you on it, but if we look it up, that actress or something, you'll find it. But it is coming out, and there's a movie now also that hasn't opened in the United States yet, but I think is up for a Cannes Film Best Picture, whatever, about the Cuban Five. It's called The Wasp Network, which was what their name was, Red Avista. And it stars Penelope Cruz. It's directed by one of the top French directors, Olivier Assayas, I think is his name. I'm not sure. But he's, this if it'll ever open in New York, that would be great. I'd love to see it, but they haven't done it yet. It's played in Europe for about a year. Yes?
Organic nature of a revolution when you're dealing with a nation state versus an empire. Because America seems to be more analogous to maybe Rome towards the end, or maybe the Ottoman Empire. And revolutions tend to, I think, take on a different color. You see more civil wars in these kind of, when you're dealing with empire, especially large empire, barring like collapse where there would be opportunities. How do you see? Do you see anything?
I think you're right. The most important thing is to root yourself. Evolutionary-minded activists and young people that are becoming involved in struggles have to. The most important thing is to root yourself in the struggles that exist. So if you're a revolutionary-minded intellectual, to root yourself in the working class. If you're a revolutionary-minded worker, that's organized and part of a struggle, to carry that out, to reach out to other workers. And that's the most important thing, to have that perspective of rooting your struggles amongst the oppressed and the exploited. The second most important thing is to maintain your political independence. This is one of the great lessons of Fidel, because he built a revolutionary movement in Cuba, as we saw in the last class, and supported that when it happened. Fidel lived to be 90. It's quite an amazing thing. All of his peers, the revolutionary elements that came up in his life, were all murdered young. He's the only one that survived. You look at Maurice Bishop, was murdered at the age of 39. Thomas Sankara, the great African revolutionary from Burkina Faso, murdered at 37 in a counter-revolutionary coup. Malcolm X, 39. Che Guevara, 39. So, of all those forces, those revolutionary struggles that developed. So Fidel had a lot of experience and was able to oversee that whole period. to answer your question, I would just say that maintaining your political independence, and if you're rooted in the oppressed, if you're rooted in the working people and their struggles, and you go through those experiences with them, and you maintain your political independence, then when mass explosions take place, you will rise with them. And then out of that, I think the left, so-called, in the United States, over the last many years, because of the dominance of the two-party system in the United States, because it's so difficult to chart, I mean, really since Malcolm X, and when I do my Malcolm X classes, this was one of the most amazing things about Malcolm X was his political independence. I mean, after he broke with the Nation of Islam. There's never been such a powerful force in U.S. politics that was for the independence of working people, in this case the black working class component of the working class as a whole, than Malcolm X, such a powerful proponent of political independence. And we said, you know, difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, the Republicans stick the knife in your back 6 inches and the Democrats pull it out 1. You know, I mean, Malcolm had this way of just encapsulating, you know, the reality. But when these struggles break out, you see they come up time and time again. They can get diverted into things that dilute them. Like, for example, in Chile, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen in Chile. There's a big upsurge in Chile today, a revolt against this Pinochetist constitution, the neoliberal legacy, all of these things. We've seen mass explosions, but the major forces in Chile, the progressive forces, the Communist Party of Chile, the remnants of the Socialist Party, that are mass parties that are part of this upsurge, but their perspective is to reform the Constitution, to do it within the framework, and that may be all you can get at this point. But there's a perspective in all of these regimes. In Latin America, we've seen, in my opinion, the limitations in the last period because of the experience of Venezuela, the Bolivia, the so-called pink tide. At a certain point, when you have progressive governments that come to power, it sets in motion a polarization in society, and the right wing and the capitalist forces, they fight back. You know, and we can even say it in U.S. politics. Suppose somebody like Bernie Sanders came to power in the United States through some serendipity of events, and he got the nomination, and then, you know, through some incredible, he became. If that happened, you know, and he tried to implement his very radical program on the face of it. I mean, to me, I don't remember the last time there was such a radical program for a Capitalist Party candidate that had a chance of winning, maybe since Ulysses S. Grant, when he kept the troops in the South, you know, to prevent to finish the smashing of the slave owners during the Reconstruction period. But if that was to happen, and you can see it in some of the, you know, fevered opposition that he's generated among a lot of these people, and these rich people, you know, they would start to withhold their money. They would start to do the same things to create a crisis that then they can blame on him. You know, so when that happens, and in a third world country, that's 10 times more, you know, because, you know, so in a country like Venezuela, so you begin to do that. When Chavez began to reform the Constitution, to give fisheries more rights, to do, you know, relatively, you know, not anti-capitalist per se, but not pro-socialist per se, but measures that went against the prerogatives of the capitalist class. They don't like that. It's not a question of making a socialist revolution. You know, when Fidel started reducing the rents, they freaked out, let alone land reform, let alone smashing Jim Crow, let alone throwing out the mafia, let alone none of these per se were socialist measures, but they limited the prerogatives of the ruling class. And they don't like that. They're not going to wait till you know, Arbenz in Guatemala, you know, mild reforms. They weren't really revolutionary reforms. Set up rural clinics, you know, that's how Che Che was working in a rural clinic because the Arbenz government decided that they were going to try to do something to alleviate the horrible conditions that these banana workers working for what's now Chiquita, that was owned, that John Foster Dulles was the lawyer for the United Fruit Company, you know, that had all these semi-slave plantations in Guatemala. And so the Arbenz government says, well, okay, you know, maybe we can't force you to raise the wages of these people, but we'll at least set up some rural clinics so people can get treated, you know. And Che was doing that. He was a doctor. He was idealistic. He wanted to be a humanitarian. He starts and he says, Jesus, I keep treating people for the same things. I cure them. They come back a few months later. They got the same illness because these are illnesses of poverty, of exploitation, of working conditions, and breathing all this crap and everything else. So he said, I came to the conclusion that to be a revolutionary doctor, there would first have to be a revolution, you know. So now, the point is that when that starts to happen, when that dynamic starts to take place, you know, in society, then you have to be prepared to counter that, you know. And if you try to take measures, if the limits of your social and economic program is merely to build a mixed economy, to just have a welfare state, as advanced as that is, like what Lula did. I forget what it's called, the Bolsa program or whatever, where they radically decreased poverty. Wonderful stuff. But it was still within the framework of the world economy. There was still, commodity prices were high. They were able to sell a lot of soybeans, a lot of stuff on world markets, get a lot of foreign exchange, and had the money from foreign exchange to do that. And they had the Cuban doctors that were willing to help them, you know, set up clinics in the rural areas. So, you know, that's, when that comes, that's it now. That's called the class struggle. The class struggle is not only one side, it's the other side. So you have to be prepared for that. So I still feel that you need to build a revolutionary organization, you know, that can be in the vanguard of those struggles, that can link with the mass struggles. Okay, we're 10 minutes to 9. If there's any last question or two. Yes, over here. We'll end right at 9 or earlier. Yes, sir.
You think there's a difference in the organic nature of the revolution when you're dealing with a nation state versus an empire? Because America seems to be more analogous to maybe Rome towards the end, or the Ottoman Empire, and revolutions tend to take on a different color. You see more civil wars in these kind of, when you deal with empires, especially large empires, barring like collapse where there will be opportunities. How do you see?
I think you're right. We're talking about examples of basically semi-colonial, third world, whatever the current emerging markets or, you know, developing countries. I hate all these euphemisms that they use. But when we're talking about advanced capitalist countries, and in the case of the United States, since World War II, the U.S., it's not like there haven't been contradictions between the U.S. and other capitalist powers, the European powers, but the U.S. emerged out of World War II as the dominant imperialist power. And now we're in a different, I think we're in the transition to a different historical period, because we're seeing the erosion of U.S. financial power, the erosion of U.S. Economic power, the erosion of U.S. political influence and weight in the world. They still have this massive military superiority, but at the same time, the American people are fed up with endless wars, and it's hard to see what benefits, and this becomes a debating between different factions, and so I think you're right. I think the convulsions in the United States, especially as the empire starts to erode the influence and all these questions, because they cannot control events. I mean, if they ever could, but they're less able to control events now. Things take place that are, they just emerge, a crisis. Who would have thought that in Lebanon, there would be a mass upsurge where for the first time Shiite and Sunni Lebanese, because anybody knows the history of Lebanon, I mean, my God, civil wars, massive, are fighting together against austerity. Who would have expected that, you know. So again, it's you can't predict, but I think you're right. I think that's the framework in which it evolves in the United States, because you have that ruling class that is addicted to military spending, addicted to war, addicted to that, and yet they're not able to forge the lines. Like Trump, I mean, what he's doing in the Middle East by relying completely on Saudi Arabia, you know, is that really a smart strategy? I mean, if Saudi Arabia, which is sort of like the old Tsarist empire in the Middle East, you know, if that starts to collapse, is that really where you know, does that really put the U.S. in a position, you know, in their area? Okay, yes, right over here.
What do you think we can learn from Fidel Castro in like building a revolution, mobilizing it, and kind of sustaining a revolution?
Well, that's been what we've been trying to talk about here, but I think the main thing we can learn from Fidel is the method of, you know, the understanding. Like he says, like Marxism taught me the society of the haves and the have-nots, taught me the class struggle, to root yourselves in the oppressed, to be politically independent, not to copy any tactic. There's no tactical recipe that the life of Fidel teaches you that this tactic is going to be correct here.
We're talking about
armed struggle. I mean, if you could have a schematic view of Fidel and say, well, we should launch an armed struggle in the United States. You know, if that would be superficial at this point, because Fidel would never have advocated that. You know, there have to be the right conditions. But the idea is to have a method of thinking, a method of analyzing the relationship of forces in society. Fidel's brilliance was not particularly this tactic or that tactic, but his worldview and his understanding of what the relationship of forces was at any given time.
And now we're in a different, I think we're in the
Southern
transition
Africa,
to a
because this is one of the most
historical period,
brilliant
because we're
things that I
seeing
really,
the
everybody, I
erosion
pushed this
of
book
U.S.
before.
financial power.
I mean,
the erosion
if
of
you're
U.S.
looking for a book, you're finishing the book you got,
the
check
erosion
this
of
out
U.S.
by the
political
great
influence
scholar
and weight
Piero
in the world.
Gleason.
They still have this massive military
into the archives
superiority,
of everybody, the
but at the
Soviets,
same
the
time,
Cubans, and everything.
American people
And in the
are
case
fed
of
up with
Southern
endless wars,
Africa,
and it's hard to
after they had
see what
defeated
benefits, and this becomes
the South Africans at the Battle of Cuba, and they started a headlong
I think
retreat.
you're right. I think the
And
convulsions
the
in the
Cubans
United
were,
States,
Fidel was
especially as
facing
the empire
the
starts to,
question, okay, we just
erode
defeated them,
the influence and all these
and we
questions,
defeated
they
them by
cannot control
bailing out the Soviets who had
events.
screwed up. It's all documented in this
if they ever
book.
could,
They
but
defeated
they're
them
less
at
able
the
to
Battle of
control
Puerto
events. Now,
Cunavale,
things take place
and they were chasing them, and they were in
they
headlong
just
retreat.
emerged,
So Fidel says,
a
okay,
crisis. Who would have thought
should
that
we
in
try to
Lebanon,
follow them
there would be a
into
mass upsurge where
Namibia
for the first
and
time
all the way to the
Shiite
South African border?
and Sunni
Or
Lebanese,
what would
because
what would
anybody
be
knows
the
history
implications of that?
Lebanon, I
The
mean, my
United
God,
States,
civil
which at
wars,
that time was
you know,
completely
massive,
in a
or
bind.
fighting
They
together
were
against
supporting South
austerity.
Africa.
Who
They had covert
expected
action
that?
against all this
You know,
stuff, but at the
so,
same time,
again, it's-
they
it's,
couldn't
you can't
openly come
predict,
out
but
and
I think
say they
you're
were
right. I think
supporting
that's the
South
framework
Africa
in
because
which
of
it evolves in the
anti-apartheid
United
sentiment
States,
in the United
because
States,
you have
especially
that
in the
ruling
black
class that
community.
is
You know, and that was a
addicted
factor, so
to
they had to do
military
everything
spending,
secretly,
addicted
covert,
to
lie
war,
about it, and all that stuff.
addicted to
So
that,
Fidel
and
said, well,
yet
if
they're not
you know, they
able to
calculated,
forge the line.
if we
Like
go over
Trump,
the
I mean, what are you doing
Namibian
in the
border,
Middle East?
you know,
By relying completely on
then
Saudi
the U.S.
Arabia.
will have a pretext.
You
It could
know,
be some of the broader
is that
support
really a
we've won.
smart
You know,
strategy?
let's use
I mean,
this
if
victory
Saudi
to
Arabia,
force
which
the
is sort of
South
like the-
African government
like the old Tsarist
to get at
empire
the
in the Middle
negotiation
East, you
table,
know,
force the
if that
United
starts
States
to-
and force
to
them
collapse, is that really where,
to implement the law that they had violated, the UN resolution to grant Namibia independence. And they did that.
Yes, right
and
over
they
here.
also, they knew that that would also further lead, which had already begun, the unraveling of apartheid in South Africa. So that's, you know, that's assessing the relationship of forces. What you can do, the great, the guy, the Farrell Dobbs, who isn't mentioned in the movie The Irishman, but is the guy that really organized, a revolutionary, that organized all the Teamsters in the United States in the 30s, a massive organizing campaign, was a revolutionary. He said, in the labor movement and in revolutionary politics, you take what you're strong enough to take. So Fidel understood, and when I say Fidel, I mean the whole revolutionary leadership, They did that. That was the tactic, and they won. And it led to that, and they made that calculation. That doesn't mean that, okay, now whenever I'm in a situation like that, I'm going to do this, A, B, and C like Fidel did. No, it's the method. It's the way of thinking. It's trying to think out, but always within starting from what's the interest of the oppressed and the exploited. If you do that, you'll never go wrong, as long as you root yourself in the interests of the working class. That's it. Thank you very much.